Another element of social disorganization theory has to do with what Sean McKay called cultural transmission. According to them, there's also this other kind of cultural transmission element to the crime process in neighborhoods that they wanted to distinguish as being kind of an additional, a slightly different part of the story. So in this, basically what they argued is, yes, these communities are broken down, they don't have norms, expectations, values, and crime happens. But they also wanted to explain why crime really persists in these neighborhoods. And they wanted to explain some of the observations that they made in Chicago, looking at what goes on in youth gangs. And they used this cultural transmission element to describe the fact that in a lot of delinquent groups in youth gangs, what tends to happen is older youths pass on delinquency to younger teens who then, become the leaders eventually. So that was their way of describing how not only do these neighborhoods kind of evolve and develop, but this is why crime is so stable. And if you remember that book that I told you about at the beginning of the semester, The Jack Roller, Clifford Shaw actually follows this kid around for about a decade of his life, informally, over the span of about a decade. And that's really where he got this idea. He observed this boy not only learning kind of how to be a delinquent and how to commit crime, but he saw this boy kind of learning from older kids around him that, getting into trouble, committing crime, doing delinquent acts is an okay thing to do. So let's model out this social disorganization theory so that you guys understand kind of the process that Sean McKay were talking about, because there's a couple elements to it. First off, you start out with these background factors. They're talking about population heterogeneity, mobility, and low SES, poverty. Those are the background factors for them that are problematic because they can cause a community to become disorganized. So again, communities that are experiencing social disorganization, that's what that SD stands for, can't realize common values, they can't get together and solve problems as a community. And that's a problem, according to Sean McKay, because it leads to a breakdown in informal social control. Social control agents, things like parents monitoring people, neighborhood watch groups, community groups, networks between neighbors, all of those things get broken down and aren't able to flourish in a neighborhood like this. So, in a neighborhood where informal social control is so weak, crime, especially crime by delinquent teens, is able to thrive and flourish. And it can maintain over time because there's this transmission process where delinquent teen groups kind of indoctrinate and initiate younger teens along the way. So those are the basic elements of this theory. And, first and foremost, what I want you to remember about a theory like this is it's a control theory. I mean, it's called social disorganization, but some people also just call it neighborhood control theory, because what it's saying is we all need controls. In the absence of controls, we commit crime. Neighborhoods like this have high crime because they are not exerting any control over their adults, kids, and the people that are most high risk to be committing crime, these adolescents, teenagers, young adults. So social disorganization was a very popular theory when it first came out. But it came under a lot of fire in the coming decades and really kind of went away for a while in the mid-20th century. And there were a lot of criticisms of some of the ideas in this theory. One of the big criticisms of social disorganization as a theory of crime is that it's very deterministic. And what I mean by that is it's very deterministic about the behaviors of people who live in that zone 2. If you think about it, it's kind of assuming that people within that zone are going to commit crime, or at least young teen boys within that community. It doesn't really have a good explanation for why so many people live in extreme poverty and don't go out and commit crime. So in that way, it's a bit deterministic. It also has this idea, this concept, that neighborhoods can be socially disorganized. But, in and of itself, that's kind of a vague concept. How do you measure whether or not a community is realizing common values? You can probably kind of imagine a way to do it, but especially initially, people tended to kind of avoid actually defining it and measuring it, and just kind of saying poor neighborhoods that have high crime must be disorganized without really necessarily getting into it in details. And really another one of the big criticisms of social disorganization theory has come in the past few decades, and it has to do with the types of populations we're talking about. So back when Sean McKay wrote this theory, it was 1940s Chicago, and they were writing about Chicago from the early 1920s up to then. Well, in a lot of these disorganized communities within this Zone 2, these heterogeneous groups were European immigrants. They were coming from all different parts of Europe. They weren't speaking the same languages. They weren't connecting with each other. And that really served as a strong basis for their theory, that these mixed groups of impoverished people can't form and unite. Well, one thing we know about urban development in the past few decades is urban immigrants are not just Western European or even Eastern European anymore. The urban landscape in terms of immigrant populations is very dramatically changing. And we just don't know yet whether or not this theory can apply as well to this new immigrant population. It might be the case that Southern American, Central American, Asian, African immigrant groups might not behave in the same ways. They might be better able to organize and come together. We don't really know yet. So that is one of the criticisms that's still kind of lingering about this theory. And another criticism that came out of the initial work has to do with patrolling issues and problems with measurement. So Clifford Shaw and Henry McKay collected police arrest data for crimes, meaning whenever a policeman made an arrest for an incident, that's when they recorded the crime in their data. Well, one thing we know about the police is that they tend to patrol particular areas more than others. So when you think about those zones, those concentric zones of Chicago areas for living, it might be the case that all the crime gets found in the zone in transition because that's where the cops are. So even though more crime might be happening there, we don't really know how much crime is happening in suburban, rural areas outside because there's just not as much detection. So this measurement issue is something that Sean McKay didn't really have a great answer for at the time. There have been a bunch of people in the past 30 or so years that have tried to revive and update social disorganization theory so that it can continue to be used as an explanation for criminal behavior. There's a lot about this theory that people didn't want to just throw away after Sean McKay's initial work. And what's happened in the past several decades has been a development of what we would call a systemic model of neighborhood control. And in these systemic models, essentially, the biggest thing that they did, which is updating Sean McKay's original model, is they really clarified what it means to be socially disorganized, what social disorganization means, how to operationalize it, and measure it in a set of data. So what these systemic models did is they defined social disorganization as being neighborhoods with really sparse friendship networks, not a lot of people connecting with each other, a lot of unsupervised teen groups, a lot of kids just kind of hanging out on corners, not doing much, and low participation in organizations, things like PTA, Neighborhood Watch, church organizations, etc. So what they would do is they would go out, people who used this model would go out into cities and collect data about these factors. And if neighborhoods scored really low on all of these things, if they had a lot of, they didn't have a lot of friendship networks, if they had a lot of teen groups, if they didn't have a lot of participation in organizations, that is when researchers felt confident in saying, yes, that neighborhood is disorganized. And when you actually do it that way, when you systematically measure disorganization in this kind of new method, the theory still holds water. It's still supported. Neighborhoods that score high on these things, that they have high social disorganization, are the ones that are still the most likely to have very stable, long-term, high levels of crime. The future of this theory probably lies in one of its most recent updates, and that's been done in the past decade or so by a Harvard sociologist by the name of Robert Sampson and several of his colleagues in a few papers and a book or two over the course of the past decade. And what Rob Sampson and colleagues did is they renamed the theory and they gave it kind of a new spin and a new interpretation. So they renamed the theory a theory of collective efficacy. And the reason for this is they saw a couple problems with social disorganization theory as it previously stood. One of the problems was they disliked the fact that people tended to only look at these demographic, large-level aggregate characteristics to explain variation in crime rates. They didn't think that we can fully explain crime variation by just looking at things like a community's friendship networks or median income or any other kind of aggregate level ideas. Instead, what they wanted to do is try to actually tap into and measure a community's level of social cohesion and a community's level of willingness to intervene for the common good. So they called this a community's collective efficacy. And their theory of collective efficacy basically described what it means to be a collective, to be a socially cohesive group, and to have efficacy, to have an ability and an efficiency in maintaining and monitoring and intervening in your neighborhood. That's what the theory kind of was all about. Basic idea of the theory was that places with more collective efficacy should have less crime. And they've done this in a couple different places. They've done it internationally. When you measure this kind of neighborhood control idea in this light, it does tend to have pretty solid support. That collective efficacy seems to be a pretty good predictor of crime. Neighborhoods that don't have it, can't maintain it, tend to have fairly high, stable crime rates. Neighborhoods that can develop a level of collective efficacy tend to have kind of low crime. And this was an interesting study because this is kind of an example of one of those studies where they found that it's not always the case that disadvantaged communities are dangerous and bad. Some disadvantaged communities that are very closely knit, that are very cohesive, that have a good understanding amongst each other of how the community is going to run, they can still be pretty safe. And this was kind of their way of tackling that and accounting for the fact that you don't necessarily have to come from a certain demographic profile to develop collective efficacy in your community.